For 34 years, Russia's most westward military outpost in Europe sat quietly in a thin strip of land along the eastern edge of Moldova, forgotten by most of the world, dismissed as an anomaly of the Soviet collapse, and carefully maintained by Moscow as a frozen conflict that gave it leverage over a small, poor country it had no intention of letting escape. That outpost is called Transnistria, and in the first months of 2026, Moldova did something that the Kremlin had spent 3 decades trying to prevent. It began dismantling Russia's control over it, piece by piece, without firing a single shot. The story of what is happening to Moldova's Russian land bridge is a story about how a small country, with almost no military, flanked by an active war on one side and a hostile Russian proxy on the other, found a way to use economic pressure, legal precision, EU, accession requirements, and the quiet protection of Ukraine's front line to begin resolving a conflict that had been declared unresolvable for a generation. And it is happening right now, with Moldovan President Maia Sandu standing in Kiev on April 26, 2026, alongside Volodymyr Zelensky, announcing a new international framework for Transnistria's reintegration on the 40th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, at the moment when Russia's grip on Moldova's territory is looser than it has been at any point since 1992. Start with what Transnistria actually is, because most of the world has no idea, and its obscurity is precisely the feature that Russia has relied upon to maintain it as a strategic asset without anyone paying attention. Transnistria is a narrow sliver of Moldovan territory on the left bank of the Dniester River, running along Moldova's eastern border with Ukraine. It covers about 12% of Moldova's land area and contains about 8% of its population. In 1990 and 1991, as the Soviet Union collapsed, a secessionist movement backed by Soviet military forces declared Transnistria independent from Moldova. A brief war in 1992, which Russia's 14th Army participated in on the separatists' side, ended in a ceasefire that left Transnistria outside Chisinau's effective control. No United Nations member state has ever recognized Transnistrian independence. Moldova has never accepted it legally, and Russia has maintained a garrison of approximately 1,500 soldiers in the region ever since, providing the military backbone of the enclave's separation from its host country. For 3 decades, Russia used Transnistria for several distinct strategic purposes simultaneously. It was leverage over Moldova. As long as Russian troops sat on Moldovan soil in a region outside Chisinau's control, Moldova could not fully exercise sovereignty, could not join NATO without a massive crisis, and could not pursue EU accession without resolving a territorial conflict that Russia controlled the terms of. It was a test case. Every decision Brussels made about whether and how to engage with Moldova's Transnistria problem revealed the limits of Western willingness to confront Russian presence on European soil outside the Ukraine context. And it was, most importantly, a potential endpoint for Russia's most ambitious strategic vision. A land bridge connecting Russia through southern Ukraine to Odessa and then to Transnistria, creating a continuous Russian-controlled corridor from the Russian border to a military garrison deep inside Europe. That land bridge vision is what died in 2022 when Russia's southern offensive failed to capture Odessa. It is what died more completely when Ukraine's defenses stabilized the front line far from the Transnistrian border. And it is what Sandu declared definitively dead on April 26, 2026. In the language of someone who now feels safe enough to say it, Ukraine's biggest contribution to Moldova is that it keeps the Russian army far from Moldova's borders. That sentence, spoken by the president of Moldova standing next to the president of Ukraine in Kiev, would not have been sayable 3 years ago. It is sayable now because the military reality on the ground has made it true, and because Moldova has spent the time the Ukrainian front line created using every other available tool to sever its institutional and economic connections to Moscow, before Russia has any opportunity to restore the military route that would give it leverage back. The most significant of those severings happened on April 8th and 9th, 2026, when Sandu signed the decrees formally, withdrawing Moldova from the Commonwealth of Independent States, the post-Soviet intergovernmental organization that Russia has used for 3 decades as a tool of economic and political leverage over former Soviet republics. Moldova's parliament had already backed the withdrawal in 2 readings. Sandu's signature transformed what had been a political trajectory into a legal irreversibility. Moldova is no longer institutionally bound to a Moscow-dominated post-Soviet structure, and the Moldovan Foreign Ministry's justification for the exit made the geopolitical statement in language that left no ambiguity. Russia has violated the CIS's key principles by waging war against Ukraine, threatening Georgia, and illegally maintaining its troops on Moldovan territory. The significance of the CIS exit extends beyond symbolism. Russia's justification for maintaining its military presence in Transnistria has rested partly on CIS peacekeeping frameworks. the institutional architecture through which Moscow claimed authority to station troops in disputed post-Soviet territories as a conflict management mechanism. With Moldova no longer a CIS member, that institutional cover becomes legally untenable. Chisinau has not yet pressed this point publicly, carefully managing the escalation optics of a confrontation it is not ready to force. But it has named the implication. In its February 2026 non-paper to Brussels, Moldova's Bureau for Reintegration described the Russian military presence in Transnistria as illegal and its withdrawal as a non-negotiable requirement, language that signals intent to use every legal lever available as EU accession talks advance. The EU accession track is the second major mechanism Moldova is using to alter the Transnistrian situation without military force. Moldova became an EU candidate country in June 2022, and accession negotiations have been advancing since. The accession process creates a powerful incentive structure. Brussels has made clear that Moldova cannot fully integrate into the European Union, while a significant portion of its territory remains outside its legal and administrative control under Russian military occupation and economically disconnected from Moldovan and EU law. This means that every chapter of EU accession negotiations, Moldova completes. Every reform it implements, every standard it meets, brings Chisinau closer to a moment when the EU itself has an institutional interest in resolving Transnistria rather than simply acknowledging it as an unsolved complication. Moldova's February 2026 14-page non-paper to Brussels, submitted by Deputy Prime Minister Valeriu Ceveri at a meeting with EU Enlargement Commissioner Marta Kos, makes this framing explicit. The document establishes Moldova's goal of peacefully reintegrating Transnistria and lays out the steps Chisinau believes are required: demilitarization, de-oligarchization, and democratization of the region. It states with unusual directness that negotiations cannot resolve the Transnistria issue, that the 5+2 format, including Russia, Ukraine, the EU, the US, and the OSCE, is dysfunctional because Moscow and Tiraspol lack the political will for a viable settlement. And it makes the most consequential political statement in any official Moldovan document on this subject. Chisinau is clear it no longer intends to work with Russia on Transnistria. Instead, it sees Russia as a threat and an obstacle. Carnegie Endowment analyst Maxim Samarukov described the significance of that framing precisely. Moldova's plan follows a noticeable shift in the EU's approach. Early in the Ukraine war, EU officials allowed for the possibility that Transnistria could join the EU separately and later. But after Moldova's pro-European Party of Action and Solidarity won crucial parliamentary elections in 2025, Brussels changed tack. It now believes Chisinau should swiftly come to grips with the Transnistria conflict. The EU is no longer treating Transnistria as someone else's problem that Moldova will have to solve on its own eventually when conditions allow. It is treating it as a precondition for accession that needs to be addressed now, with EU support and EU leverage, and without Russia as a recognized negotiating partner. The economic siege of Transnistria is the third and most immediately visible element of Moldova's strategy. In January 2025, Ukraine cut off Russian gas transit across its territory, ending the flow of Russian gas that had been the primary energy source for Transnistria's electricity generation and heavy industry. That single decision, made in Kiev for reasons related to the Ukraine war and the refusal to continue funding Russia's war machine through transit fees, plunged Transnistria into an energy crisis that has been deepening ever since. Industrial output in the region dropped 43%. Trade fell by 31.5%. Energy production was cut in half. Metallurgy and chemical industry output, the backbone of Transnistria's economy, declined by more than 60%. GDP was expected to fall 12%. Inflation rose 16%. Russia's response to Transnistria's energy crisis was revealing in what it chose not to do. Despite the economic collapse in the region, Russia reportedly blocked Transnistria from receiving energy imports from the West, preferring to let the region suffer rather than risk losing political control if Western energy made the population feel less dependent on Moscow. Russia rerouted some gas through Hungary in small, inconsistent volumes, enough to keep the connection alive symbolically, but not enough to prevent the economic deterioration. The Kremlin calculated that a suffering Transnistria that remained dependent on Russia was more useful than a comfortable Transnistria that had found a Western alternative. Sergei Shoigu, now Russia's Security Council secretary, described the situation in an interview published April 21st, 2026, as dire, with systemically important enterprises non-operational or functioning sporadically, energy shortages, and worsening conditions. He blamed Chisinau, Ukraine, and the EU. Simultaneously, which is essentially an acknowledgement that the economic pressure on Transnistria is coming from all directions and is working as designed. The Moldovan power station, a major electricity generating facility in Transnistria that had been supplying power to Moldova proper at relatively reasonable prices, effectively shut down after the gas cutoff. Shoigu complained about this in the same interview, describing it as Chisinau's power plant being switched off. The framing reveals the strategic logic. Transnistria's energy infrastructure was simultaneously a Kremlin leverage tool. Russia controlled the gas that powered it, and a source of economic benefit to Moldova itself, which was buying the electricity. When Moldova decided to stop buying from the Russian gas-powered Transnistrian plant and build alternative supply relationships within the EU energy system, it accepted a short-term economic cost to sever a dependency that gave Russia leverage. That was the deliberate calculation. Moldova absorbed the cost. Russia lost the leverage point. The broader EU framework that is reshaping Transnistria's strategic situation was described by EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas in a proposal circulated to member states in early 2026. The proposal outlined a comprehensive peace framework requiring Russia to withdraw its troops from Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, and Transnistria, linking the Transnistrian troop question to the broader post-Ukraine war negotiating landscape, rather than treating it as a separate bilateral Moldova-Russia issue. If Russian troop withdrawals become part of the conditions for any broader European security settlement connected to the Ukraine negotiations, Transnistria stops being Russia's internal matter and becomes part of an international process in which Russia is the party being asked to give something up. That is a fundamentally different negotiating landscape than anything that existed before February 2022. On April 26, 2026, while the rest of the world was watching ceasefire negotiations and Iranian nuclear talks, Maya Sandu stood in Kiev and said that Moldova is discussing the creation of an international mechanism to address Transnistria with EU partners, and that all sides agree a process of demilitarization, de-oligarchization, and democratization is needed. She explicitly linked Transnistria's resolution to Ukraine's military contribution. Ukraine keeps the Russian army far from Moldova's borders, which is what makes a peaceful settlement possible. Zelensky, standing next to her, said, "The continued presence of Russian forces in Transnistria remains a key obstacle to Moldova's development and poses long-term security risks." Those two statements from the leaders of Ukraine and Moldova at a press conference in Kiev on a day they had traveled to Chernobyl together represent something historically significant. The frozen conflict that Russia maintained for 34 years as a permanent veto over Moldova's sovereignty and European integration is being discussed openly with EU backing, with Ukrainian military protection, with the institutional cover of Moldova's CIS exit and EU accession track, as a problem with a solution, not a solution that involves Russia as a partner, a solution that involves Russia as a problem to be removed. Russia's isolation from the process is the most striking feature of the current Transnistrian situation. The 5+2 negotiating format that gave Russia a seat at the table is effectively dead, declared dysfunctional by Moldova's own official documents. CIS institutional cover is gone with Moldova's exit. The military land bridge that would have given Russia leverage to threaten Moldova with conventional force was blocked by Ukraine's defense of the southern front. The energy leverage that Russian gas provided was severed when Ukraine stopped transit. The economic ties that the CIS framework enabled are being replaced by EU trade relationships. What Russia has left in Transnistria is 1,500 soldiers, approximately 100 Russian officers, and the rest locally recruited, who are cut off from resupply by land, dependent on a territory whose economy is contracted by a third, and surrounded by a political and diplomatic landscape that is systematically removing every institutional foundation for their continued presence. The Transnistrian enclave is not gone. Russia's soldiers are still there. The frozen conflict has not been formally resolved. Moldova is carefully managing escalation, not forcing a crisis. But the arc of what is happening, the CIS exit, the EU accession track, the energy siege, the 14-page reintegration plan, the April 26 Sandu-Zelensky joint declaration, is unmistakable. Russia's land bridge to Western Europe through Moldova is gone. The frozen conflict that Russia maintained as permanent leverage is being unfrozen, not through military force, but through the patient, methodical, EU-backed application of economic pressure, legal precision, and the military protection that Ukraine's front line provides, by keeping Russian ground forces too far away to threaten Chisinau into submission. Moldova found a way to dismantle Russia's westernmost European outpost without fighting. And the Kremlin, for once, does not have a straightforward answer for what to do next. The The question of what the approximately 350,000 people living in Transnistria experience through all of this deserves direct attention, because the geopolitical analysis tends to discuss the enclave as an abstraction when the reality is that it is a place where people live, work, pay bills, and have been watching their economic situation deteriorate in ways that are directly attributable to the larger conflict they are embedded in. The industrial output collapse, 43% down, metallurgy and chemicals down more than 60%, is not a statistical abstraction. It represents factories shut, wages unpaid, pensions under pressure, and a population that had been told for 34 years that Russian protection was the source of their stability, now watching that stability evaporate in real time. The 16% inflation figure in an economy where many people work in the industrial sector that has contracted most severely describes real hardship. Russia's calculation in blocking Western energy imports to Transnistria, preferring to let the population suffer rather than risk losing. Influence reveals the Kremlin's actual view of the people it claims to protect. If the Transnistrian population could access Western energy at reasonable prices, they might start questioning whether Russian alignment was actually in their interest. Russia finds that questioning more threatening than the economic suffering. The population is being kept deliberately impoverished to maintain political control. The same logic Russia has applied in other breakaway territories it controls, from South Ossetia to the Donbass, where economic dependency on Russian support is the mechanism of political loyalty. Moldova's reintegration plan treats the Transnistrian population differently. Rather than collective punishment or political pressure from above, Chisinau has been steadily extending Moldovan law into the region through administrative and legal mechanisms, not forcing a political resolution, but creating the conditions in which Transnistrian residents increasingly interact with Moldovan and EU standard institutions, customs, and legal frameworks. The gradual extension of Moldovan law to areas of the unrecognized state has been underway for several years. The reintegration plan foresees this continuing, with the 1+1 direct dialogue between Chisinau and Tiraspol continuing, not expecting a breakthrough, but keeping communication open, while the legal and economic circumstances shift underneath the political superstructure. The practical lesson of what Moldova has accomplished against Russia without fighting is one that will be studied in every post-Soviet country that is trying to navigate a relationship with Moscow that it does not want but has not been able to exit. Moldova found 3 tools that worked simultaneously. Economic isolation of the Russian proxy territory through energy cutoff, made possible by Ukraine's decision to stop gas transit. Legal and institutional severance from post-Soviet Russian-dominated frameworks through the CIS exit, and the protective cover of Ukraine's front line, which kept Russian ground forces far enough away that Chisinau could take these steps without facing immediate military consequences. Remove any one of the 3, and the strategy would have been much harder. Together, they produced a situation where Russia's 34-year investment in Transnistrian leverage is visibly eroding, and the Kremlin does not have a cost-effective response available. Shoigu called it dire. Russia's foreign ministry called it short-sighted foreign policy. Putin's proxies in the Moldovan opposition called it a betrayal. All of those reactions describe the same reality from the perspective of different parties who are losing. Moldova is cutting its last institutional ties to Moscow's orbit. The land bridge to Transnistria is severed by geography, economics, and law. The soldiers in Tiraspol are stranded, and Maya Sandu is standing in Kiev talking about international mechanisms for demilitarization, while Russia's Security Council secretary issues alarm statements from Moscow that nobody is listening to. The frozen conflict is melting. And for once, it is melting in the direction that the people of Moldova chose. The broader significance of what Moldova has done and is doing extends beyond its own borders in ways that matter for every country in Russia's near abroad that is watching. Azerbaijan concluded its war with Armenia in 2023 and has reasserted territorial control. Georgia has been moving in a complicated direction, but with continued civil society pressure for European integration. Armenia itself has been distancing from Russia since the Nagorno-Karabakh collapse. The pattern of post-Soviet states finding pathways out of Russian leverage structures that were supposed to be permanent is accelerating. And Moldova's bloodless siege of Transnistria is the most methodical example of how that pathway can be navigated by a country with no military advantage, no NATO membership, and no guarantee of Western military protection. What Moldova has that mattered most was time, created by Ukraine. The military protection of Ukraine's front line gave Sandu's government the space to implement changes that would have been extremely dangerous if Russian ground forces had been in range of Chisinau. The energy siege of Transnistria would have been impossible without Ukraine's decision to end Russian gas transit. And the EU accession track would have been a rhetorical aspiration rather than a practical framework if Odessa had fallen and Russia had created its land bridge. Ukraine fought to prevent all of those things from happening. Moldova used the space that fighting created to dismantle Russia's leverage without fighting at all. On April 26, 2026, Sandu stood in Kiev and said, simply, that Ukraine keeps the Russian army far from Moldova's borders, and that this is Moldova's biggest protection. She was not just thanking Ukraine for its sacrifice. She was describing the strategic architecture that made everything else possible. The frozen conflict that Russia thought was permanent is now being described by Moldova's own president in joint press conference with Ukraine's president as a problem with a mechanism, with EU partners, with a process. That is not resolution. But it is the beginning of the end of something Russia spent 34 years building to last forever.